Here, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Plassart. Anna is a lecturer in history here at the Open University, and her research focuses on political ideas in the late 18th century. She's particularly interested in Scottish and English views of the French Revolution, and her lecture today is entitled Reimagining Democracy, Lessons from the French Revolution. So, over to Anna.
Thank you, Vincent. So let's talk about democracy. In recent years, our democracies have been increasingly criticized. We've seen a huge loss of trust in elected bodies such as parliament and assemblies. And instead, we've seen the rise of demands for more direct democracy, for bypassing parliament and placing political decisions directly in the hands of the people. And obviously, this has been happening in the UK since the Brexit referendum, but not just in the UK. It's also been happening in other places, such as my own country, France. Recently, there's been lots of protests in France demanding more direct popular involvement in government, including via an increased use of referendums. So it seems to me it's a good time to think about the history of democracy as an idea and as a political system. Democracy is one of those really complicated words that I think we tend to take a little bit for granted. Intuitively, we know that it means something along the lines of power to the people get to decide, and we know that we think it's a good thing, definitely, but beyond that, we don't always think about democracy in any great depth, and we don't always think about how we got to where we are today. So this is where history is helpful, because what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you back to a time when democracy was not taken for granted at all. A time when there were very intense, very vital debates about what democracy should mean, what its dangers were, how it could be safely implemented, and most importantly, how it could be made to last and not collapse on itself. But before I talk about the main topic, the French Revolution, I want to go back in time just a little bit further, before 1789. Because it's important to realize that in the 18th century, democracy was a dangerous word. Almost everyone who knew the word, who had heard the word democracy, thought that it was pretty much a terrible idea. And they had good reasons to think that too, because democracy really didn't have the same associations, connotations as it does today. If you were an educated 18th century person, for you, democracy would have been a thing very much of the past. It was a system that had been tried in ancient history, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and it was mostly understood in terms of direct democracy, not in terms of representative assemblies. And here I'm showing you a 19th century representation of this type of ancient democracy. This shows the Greek statesman Pericles addressing an assembly of citizens in the golden age of Athenian democracy. So these are citizens, not representatives. And really, there were very few known examples of democratic government since then. In the 18th century, it was found maybe in a few Swiss city-states, that's it. There were also a few republics, but that's not the same thing as a democracy. A republic is ruled by citizens for the common good, but citizenship is normally highly restricted, or was anyway highly restricted. So for instance, a republic could be ruled by a hereditary aristocracy, as in the Republic of Venice, which I'm showing here, very nice. Or it could be ruled by property owners only, as in the young American Republic, where only about 6% of the population could vote. So of course, this could sound a little bit odd, because the 18th century is the century of the Enlightenment. And we associate the Enlightenment with ideas of freedom, with ideas of liberty, and all good things. But in fact, very few Enlightenment writers actually defended democracy as a serious option to be implemented. Democracy was not thought of as being the future. It was thought of as being the past, the ancient past at that. And there were good reasons why people were really not very keen to repeat the experiment, because the ancient past was full of warnings about the dangers of democracy. So let me walk you through all the arguments against democracy first. First of all, democracies were thought to be violent political systems. They were violent because they depended on the support of ordinary people, and the people were imagined quite literally as being a crowd, a mob, a violent mob that could not be controlled. And if you ask someone in the 18th century to visualize democracy, assuming they were educated and had heard of the word, it probably would have looked something like this. This is an English caricature from 1784 showing an election in London. And democracies were also inherently unstable. They tended to be chauvinistic, they tended to be easily provoked, they were aggressive, they tended to start wars. And most worryingly, democracies never lasted, because sooner or later, they were always seduced by a demagogue, a strongman, a popular, charismatic leader, often a general, who gathered all the power under the pretense of working for the people, and eventually turned democracy into tyranny. And the template for this, the template for the fall of democratic republics, this was Julius Caesar, the popular general Julius Caesar, seizing power and turning Rome into a dictatorship and eventually into an empire. And here, this would be Augustus, the first Roman emperor. We'll come back to him. And this Roman example was really the reference about democracy that everyone knew and everyone was referring to in the 18th century. So this is the background for the French Revolution. This is how educated early modern Europeans thought about democracy. And I think you can see that the French revolutionaries had their work cut out for them to rehabilitate the idea. And maybe you can also see why originally the French revolutionaries were really not particularly keen on establishing a system of pure democracy or direct democracy. Instead, a lot of revolutionaries in the early days preferred systems of representative government. And England provided, or Britain, but they thought of it in terms of England, provided a really good example of this. The English system had a really good reputation. It had a lot of admirers in the National Constituent Assembly between 89 and 91. And here you can see the French deputies swearing to give France its new constitution. That's from 1791. Obviously, England was not a democracy per se in the 18th century, and no one would have described it as a democracy. But contemporaries did recognize that it had developed elements of representative democracy in its government. The principle of representative government is that instead of making every citizen vote for every single law, instead citizens elect representatives who they trust to make decisions for them instead of them. And this system, this representative system, was thought to have several really important advantages by the French admirers of the English system. It was thought to be more practical and a more stable system. It was thought that the elected representatives were more likely to be educated, they were more likely to be responsible people with a stake in society who would not be easily swayed by the lies of demagogues promising the moon. But direct democracy also had its admirers in France. And this was largely due to the influence of one writer, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So if you want to know what he looked like, why not? That's a portrait of him. But I think it's actually more interesting to look at this. This is a late 18th century painting of the tomb of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the Tuileries. And it's not, interestingly, it's not the only painting of his tomb that was in circulation at the time. And what it shows is that Rousseau was very famous in his time already, and he became even more famous after he died in 1778. And amongst other things, he was very famous for saying that the only source of political legitimacy was the people, and that the people must express their views directly, not via representatives. And as you can see from what I've said before, that was a very controversial position at the time. It was really something no one else was arguing seriously anyway. And at this point, it's worth noting that Rousseau was from the city-state of Geneva, which was a small republic with only a few thousand citizens. You can see 18th century Geneva here. It looks lovely. And it's probably Geneva that Rousseau had in mind when he was talking about direct democracy, not a state of 30 million people like France. But nevertheless, in the early years of the French Revolution, his ideas were seized on by some factions, and in particular by the Jacobin party led by Maximilien Robespierre. So in the first years of the French Revolution, between 1789 and 1791, this was really quite a heated debate between those who wanted to work with the king to establish a representative system, something a bit like the English system, and on the other hand, you had those who wanted a more radical, more direct form of democracy inspired by Rousseau's ideas. And in the end, it's the supporters of direct democracy that prevailed. And it's not so much that they won the argument per se. The issue was more that in the summer of 1791, the French king, who had been until then working with the assembly, the king tried to flee to go to the foreign monarchies that were attacking France. And he had to be arrested on his way out of France. And here you can see a drawing of the French troops forcibly bringing the king back to Paris to face the assembly. So since the king was now being tried as a traitor to France for trying to encourage foreign nations to invade France, well, the case of representative democracy of an English-type constitutional monarchy really became a little bit difficult to make. And so by default, it's the more radical advocates of direct democracy who won the day. And it almost became a competition as to who could be more against an English-type system of representative democracy. For instance, in 1792, you find Robespierre's allies saying that parliamentary democracy was just as much of a despotic force as monarchy. And you find Robespierre himself saying things like, "The root of all our problems is that our representatives have made themselves to be absolutely independent from the nation. They have destroyed the sovereignty of the nation. By their own admission, they were merely the managers of their people, yet they made themselves sovereign, or in other words, despots." That's 29th of July, 1792. And as an aside, what he's saying here, in substance, is exactly what some people have been saying in the past few years in the UK, that Parliament is denying the sovereignty of the people, is frustrating the people, and that any MP standing in the way of the popular will is a traitor. So in effect, that's shoving aside centuries of proud British representative democracy tradition and instead replacing it with a Rousseau-Robespierre French Revolution argument, which I personally enjoy, as it's quite ironic, I think. But to go back to the French king, it's actually his case that brings us the first example of, in France, of a referendum being proposed as a political tool. So let's talk about referendums a little bit. In the National Convention, that's the assembly, there was this issue of what to do with the king, who had by then been found guilty of treason. That's showing his trial at the convention. So what to do with the guilty king? Well, the more radical faction, the Jacobins and Robespierre, wanted to execute him. The more moderate faction, the Girondists, thought that this wasn't such a great idea, but they didn't want to be the ones to vote against it. Because if you voted against executing the king, kind of sounded like you weren't really against monarchy. So that was an issue. So the idea of the Girondists was to propose a referendum to make the people decide whether or not the king should be executed. And they were counting on the fact that they knew the French provinces were a lot more conservative, a lot more fond of the monarchy, and that they would not vote to execute the king. And this is interesting, not so much because it changed the course of history, which it didn't, the referendum didn't happen. It's interesting because in this first proposal for a referendum, you already see the seeds of what characterizes referendums as political tools. Historically, they tend to be used as a political tactic to bypass assemblies and legitimize controversial ideas, even though it did not work in this case. But it wasn't long before referendums came back on the table with the Constitution of 1793, France's first Republican constitution. And this constitution was ratified by referendum, the first modern large-scale referendum. Abstention was very high, about 70%, but still about 2 million men voted to adopt the constitution, with only 11,000 voting against it. And this new constitution itself planned for more referendums. It was going to use a modified system of referendums to pass all of the laws. This constitution is known as the Jacobin Constitution. It was extremely popular. It was incredibly democratic by the standards of the time. It contained the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which you can see here. And because it was so popular, it really helped consolidate the power of the Jacobins. But France was still at war against the same foreign powers invading it. And so the application of the new constitution was suspended. And I won't tell the whole story here, but this is the really famous bit of the French Revolution, with the Jacobins leading the reign of terror, killing thousands on the guillotine and ending up on the guillotine themselves. That's a painting of 1793. That's actually the king being guillotined during the terror. And this terror was very much justified explicitly in terms of direct democracy. The idea that the people is sovereign, that the will of the people trumps everything, including the right to a fair trial. And anyone who questioned the will of the people, anyone who was not supporting it enthusiastically, anyone who suggested that there should be checks and balances, they were all branded enemies of the people. They were judged in a few hours, and they were sentenced to death. That's an engraving from 1793, which says, "War to the enemies of the people." In 1794, the phrase itself, "enemies of the people," was inscribed in French laws as a crime punishable by death. And Robespierre said, the revolutionary government owes nothing to the enemies of the people but death. And you may have seen the phrase "enemies of the people" used fairly recently. It's been used in the Daily Mail here against judges. It's been used by Donald Trump recently against the press. And I know a lot of people find this disturbing anyway, but when you think of the historical weight of the phrase in French history and later in Russian history, it's really a very interesting choice of words. But going back to this Jacobin Constitution, as I said, it was approved, but it was never really applied, and the Jacobin government of Robespierre fell in 1794. But what's interesting is that this idea of referendums had taken hold in French political discourse and practice. And in particular, the idea of referendums to legitimize political power had taken hold. So when the Jacobin government was overthrown, it was overthrown by a coup, and the Jacobin Constitution was replaced by a much more conservative and much less democratic new system called the Directory. And this new government asked the people to approve the coup and legitimize the Directory with a referendum, which took place in July 1795. And this time, only 1 million men voted, and the new constitution of the Directory was approved with only 95% of votes, but still approved, nevertheless. And the story goes on in pretty much the same way. The next referendum took place in 1800, when a popular young general called Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the Directory and made himself effectively a dictator, or first consul. And the painting I'm showing you here is a later dramatization of the scene. It shows Napoleon in a sort of very soft, flattering light, I think, bringing order in the chaos of Parliament, of the Assembly, when in fact he quite literally showed up with the army and demanded to be put in charge. In any case, he wanted his coup to be and his dictatorship to be approved by the people because he wanted democratic legitimacy. So he called a referendum, and 99.9% of voters gave him their blessing. And then again in 1802, 99% agreed to have him made consul for life, and in 1804, 99% agreed to have him made Emperor of the French. So at least people were consistent. And in this engraving, you can see a contemporary depiction of one of those referendums. The sign on the wall reads, will Napoleon Bonaparte be consul for life, yes or no? And you can see people voting by writing down their names in a registry. So you may have noticed by now that history not only repeats itself here, but it's also more than a little bit familiar. Early on in the lecture, I told you that the people who lived in the 18th century were very suspicious of democracy, and especially of direct democracy, because they thought that ordinary people would be too easily seduced by demagogues, by charismatic military leaders, and that all democracies eventually turned into tyranny that way. Well, what do you know? It looks like they weren't entirely wrong. Contemporary observers absolutely thought that the turn of events in France was not a surprise at all. It replayed almost exactly the way in which another popular general, Julius Caesar, had returned from foreign conquests to become a dictator and start aggressive wars and an aggressive empire. And if you look at how Napoleon portrayed himself, as in this official portrait, it's clearly a reference that he consciously accepted too. Compare with the previous image of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, how they're both holding their right hand up. The similarities are really quite clear. So if you were a Democrat in the early 19th century, and amazingly there were still a few Democrats around, this is a really depressing story. The French revolutionaries had thought they could avoid the pitfalls of democracy, but in the end, they had replayed almost exactly the same old story. So what was to be done? Well, clearly there were no easy answers there, but by and large, the lesson that contemporary supporters of democracy took from the French Revolution was that, A, it confirmed that direct democracy really was very risky, because in practice, it was mostly used to legitimize power grabs. And two, while even representative democracy was still risky, but the risks could be alleviated if the population could be better educated with access to free press that allowed for a variety of opinions and not just government propaganda. So popular education and freedom of the press become two very important themes in 19th century, early 19th century political discourse. And that is really, I think, a central insight about democracy in general. It can really only work well when it's coupled with education and information. In the 21st century, we tend to take democracy a little bit for granted as something that's an absolute good in whatever way, shape, or form, and we sometimes forget that it comes with pitfalls and only works well under certain conditions. And to conclude, I will give you a quick preview of referendums after the French Revolution. So here you have Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, who was elected president of the French Republic in 1848, completely democratically. And when the Constitution did not allow him to stand again in 1852, he carried out a coup, which he ratified with a referendum, and then another referendum to make himself emperor, which he won handily. And here you have a caricature, which is actually about a slightly later referendum, but I thought it was funny, so I still put it in. You have ordinary people, workers, asking their mayor, what they're asking is, "Sir, what does the word referendum mean?" And the mayor answers, "It's a Latin word that means yes." So here we enter a slightly different topic, which is the question of propaganda, voters' intimidation, tendentious vote counts, and so on, all of which obviously applies throughout the entire period I've talked about, even though I haven't insisted on it. And then, of course, after Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, there's very famously, all the fascist dictators before World War II who all used referendums to justify their coups, and even Charles de Gaulle in France, who also used referendums to legitimize his personal political power. And at this stage, you may be thinking, well, I know everything has to come back to Brexit, but what does this actually have to do with our referendum? Because Brexit is many things, but it's not a coup, at least not as I speak. Who knows what will come in the coming weeks. But my suggestion would be that Brexit was in fact not a normal referendum, maybe precisely because Britain has such a strong tradition of representative democracy and has very little experience with direct democracy and referendums. So my suspicion is that British politicians may have been a little bit naive about the whole thing, because referendums historically have not been used in good faith. They have not been used because governments really wanted to know what the people thought. They have been used as political instruments to bypass democratic rules and shore up political power, to legitimize controversial measures. They are incredibly powerful tools because they give absolute legitimacy to the person or the idea that they approve. And because they give absolute legitimacy, they can and they have been used to bypass checks and balances and to bypass the rule of law. And I have already suggested that we have seen exactly this happen in Britain since the Brexit referendum, with people being called traitors for disagreeing or even just for applying the law of the land. And maybe slightly more cynically, it seems to me that David Cameron forgot the first rule of referendums, which is that you only ever ask the question when you control the media, you control the flow of information, and you're absolutely sure what answer you're going to get. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna. That was a really splendid talk and very timely, with something coming up next week, which is being badged as a second referendum in certain quarters. I wonder if I could be horribly self-indulgent and ask the first question before I go to
Please
the audience.
do it. Go ahead.
That's okay. And I'm going to take us back a little bit further than where you were and ask, to what extent do you think what happens around the early 1790s is in any way influenced by what happens in 1649 on the other side of the Channel? In the sense of, not that the Cromwell's parliamentary forces are necessarily pushing for a type of democracy, but the way in which they judge the monarch, the way in which they judge the king and assert their right to judge the king. Is that, are there echoes of that? And are there fears?
That's a good question. I would say that by and large, England is not associated with that part of English history where discussions about democracy are taking place. It is occasionally a little bit, but mostly by opponents of democracy. With the idea being that obviously this does not end well, terrible idea, let's not do it. So it's mostly used in that way. And by 1791, well, between 89 and 91, the people who talk about Britain, England, are really the people who want to big up representative democracy. So this really does not fit in their agenda. Yeah. So what doesn't fit in the agenda?
Conveniently forget.
Swept under the rug, absolutely, yeah. And even during the, I could be wrong about this, I'm sure I am wrong about this, but I don't think that there are many references to a king, to the killing of the English king when, I could be wrong about this. I will not take a position on this because I'm not sure.
Okay, that's an entirely legitimate thing to do, I think. Now, have we got any questions from the assembled ranks here for Anna? Oh, anything on the net?
Nothing on the net, but a question from me, if I may.
Perfect.
I think I'm very much in agreement with your argument here that referendums have been used as quite often pernicious political instruments. But I'm wondering if you could point to any examples where perhaps referendums have been perhaps more benign, perhaps they have actually performed quite a useful role that has perhaps provided a check or balance to despotic sort of.
That's a very fair point. I gave a very partial story of referendums here. Especially in the later 20th century, they have been used in a much more broad, a wider array of ways. That's how I'm going to phrase it. There's a difference, though. The classic example of referendums being used in a way that works pretty well is Switzerland. In the US as well, they are used on the state level, not on the federal level, but on the state level, and that also works pretty well. And the usual argument about this is that Swiss referendums are not used for really big, momentous, complicated political questions. They are used for much more specific local questions where the answer is very clear, yes or no. It's very clear what that means and what the implications are. And because they are very specific and in their outcome, it's much more difficult to use them to claim, I have the legitimacy of the people, and then do a bunch of different things. If it's about, what day the trash will be picked up, it's kind of difficult to use that to say, I should be made emperor for life.
Perhaps you could look at the recent Irish referendums as well as being exercises albeit at times quite vociferous debate, but actually genuine debate which is not being presupposed by
well, that's also a different type of question, I think. That's the other sort of classic type of question for which referendums are usually thought to be okay to use. That's big sort of moral questions about the death penalty, abortion, again, a clear yes, well, a clear yes, and not complicated political questions. That's the difference.
Thank you. Robin, did you have your...
Well, I was going to ask about Switzerland, but I won't now. Well, what about this? The alternative you're proposing is representative democracy, and I can see that at the early stages of the French Revolution that seemed quite a popular alternative. But at that time, it was also quite criticised, isn't it, in Britain, for what is seen as the corruption involved in these elections to Parliament on sort of what was sometimes a very narrow franchise and an open vote and so on. And so how much does that come into the French discussions? This sense that almost that British representative democracy only works because it is fixed. To some defenders of British democracy, it's very, Blackstone, for instance, its very strength is that it is very, very democratic.
Can I just repeat that for the mic? I'm not sure that the mic would have picked that up, but Robin has asked the extent to which the defenders of the representative as opposed to direct democracy in France, how far are they sympathetic towards representative democracy because it's kind of more easy to manipulate? Fixed was the word you used.
Well, I think the first thing to say here is that democracy in any way, shape or form in the early 19th century still has a very bad reputation. The French Revolution made things worse, basically. It had a bad reputation before, and afterwards it's even worse. And the English system is still not thought about as a democracy, even in Britain until much, much later, I think. So it's representative government, but it's not representative democracy. And I would say that it depends which supporters of democracy you're talking about in France. You have several schools. The admirers of the English system at that point are really much more insisting on the freedom of the press angle. And that's because they're living under Napoleon. Slight problem here. So that's really the angle that they really sort of admire and want to repeat. And from the perspective, that's really the cornerstone of any working democracy. It has to be freedom of the press, tied with education of the people. But what you were suggesting also exists. There's also a category of people who would call themselves Democrats who think that democracy should be used in a much more paternalistic sort of way, that it should be led by technocrats, by the educated elites and all of that. And in that sense, the English model does sort of appeal a little bit as well. Yeah.
Victor, is this from...
Yes, our first question from people watching online. This is from Thomas O'Donnell, who says, many thanks for a really interesting lecture. And his question is, what were British attitudes to the use of direct democracy at the time of the revolution? And what did the British government do in order to prevent a similar revolution in Britain?
That's a large question, thank you.
It is a large question. What did British representatives do to prevent revolution happening on this side of the channel?
Well, the first part of the question was what did they think about direct democracy? And the answer is very bad things. They thought very bad things about direct democracy in Britain at the time. It's everything I said earlier on in my talk about the mob. They will behead us all. Very much that still. And the propaganda machine of the British government, was very much full on in the early 1790s about that. What they did to prevent similar risings from arriving in Britain, well, it's actually very debated in historiography whether or not there was a real danger of revolution in Britain at the time. I would tend to think that there probably wasn't, but that's my personal opinion. Other people would disagree. And what they did, well, they basically repression. They repressed militarily, they repressed in terms of passing laws that limited freedom of the press, they stopped gatherings of radicals, and they pretty much crushed the English radical movement in around 1793, 1795. It completely disappeared, the English radical movement. And not even talking about the Irish, that's even worse. Yeah.
Lovely. Any follow-up?
There's another question online if we don't know.
No, far away.
This is from our very own Chris Williams. How much do we need to think about the physical practice of referendums? That picture of the people signing up to support Napoleon looked as much like everyone making a public registration. So, who invents the secret ballot as a demand, and what impact does it have?
Yeah. So I thought I may get this sort of question because I talk about big ideas and, sort of don't talk about the practice very much. So that picture you saw, that was under Napoleon, that was 1802, I think. So in the early years of the French Revolution, there's really no set practice about how people vote. Sometimes people gather together in sort of village assemblies, and the way of voting is people who agree stand up, or people who agree sort of shout yay, or sometimes it was written down, but quite rarely. And that's actually a really, really big problem in terms of counting. The statistics I gave you earlier, they're a little bit dodgy, because what would often happen was that an assembly would vote, yay, yes, and it would be, and if there were 100 people in the village hall, it would be counted as 100% yes, because there were no personal sort of record of who had thought what. So it makes things a little bit dodgy, as I said, and same thing with, these voting counts were also very much manipulated by the government, by the army, by Napoleon. Napoleon was notorious for just counting the army as a yes, or millions of army people, that's just a yes, and distributing the yeses as well in the circumscriptions that did not have quite good enough results. So adding army votes to pad up, if some area had not voted yes quite enough, so he would do that. And this variety of practices continued pretty much until Napoleon. So Napoleon was really the time when voting practices started becoming standardized. And one of the ways that they were standardized was this practice of registries that you saw in that picture, I think. And that would be people writing their names. As Chris quite rightfully noted, that is not secret voting. So it falls under all those caveats of voter intimidation, social pressure. Everybody knows what everybody voted, all of that. So it is not what we think about today when we think of a referendum as a sort of honest secret vote. And the answer to the question of when secret voting first started is I don't know.
In France?
In France, yeah.
Okay. We have to wait quite a long time in the UK. It's 1868, 9, something like that. So, anything else from the audience?
If democracy's reputation was so bad after the French Revolution, why were there still some groups in Britain that were calling for it?
For democracy?
If its reputation was so bad, democracy's reputation in this country, why were some groups still calling for it? This is in the early part of the 19th century.
Well, you would be hard-pressed to find many people advocating direct democracy in early 19th century Britain. What you found, the people who were sort of the radicals of the time, tended to be people who wanted a radical expansion of the English franchise. And that's really not the same thing. And that was understandable within the British system. Yeah.
I don't think you see people like Henry Hunt advocating any kind of direct mass democracy. That may have been understood by his audiences.
You can always find exceptions. You can always find exceptions.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was a lonely. I mean, in fact, I know a few lonely people there who were advocating sort of, but it was really, really not mainstream, even among only the representatives, the advocates of democracy. Yeah.
Anything more from the floor, or from the web?
Well, I have there's one statistic you gave which I found fascinating, that only 6% of people in the US were able to vote at the beginning. Yeah. And our image of America is always of one man, one vote at least, if not. So how did they limit the vote, the electorate there?
Yeah, so as I said, the United States early on was not, I'm generalizing here, but broadly it was not conceptualized, including by its founders, as a democracy. It was conceptualized as a republic, very much on the ancient models of republics. And the way you are a citizen in the ancient model is you have to have a stake in society. To have a stake in society, you have to own property. So it was property-owning men who were allowed the right to vote. Yeah.
And that was, that's a very slender portion of the population, even.
Yeah, they have really good PR, the US.
Lovely. Anything more from our audience?
Why was referendum such a popular tool for choosing, as a way of choosing an answer for complicated questions?
So it depends who you ask. If you ask the people who are in power, it's popular because it allows you to pass measures that are a little bit controversial and make them non-controversial. Because if you have a controversial idea and you can get the people to vote for it, then there's no debate. It's a done thing. So it's popular with politicians for that reason, and it's popular among the population because it's nice to be asked, right? Like it's
What? Anything more from the internet? Well, thank you very much, Anna. I think it's an absolutely splendid talk and very contemporary. And thank you very much for enlightening us all.
Thank you.
This is very sadly our last of our OU50 history talks for the time being, at least, as Vincent said at the beginning. But maybe we'll come back, and I hope that you've all enjoyed it here, and those people watching online have enjoyed it as well. But anyway, round of applause for Anna.
Thank you.